Richard E. Byrd, first to blaze an air route to the North Pole, prepares for a similar flight over the bottom of the Earth.
For 77 years, the secret to Admiral Richard E. Byrd's Antarctic expeditions remained frozen, buried in military records and the mind of one individual. Now, prior to his death, the last survivor has broken his silence. What he says is more than history. It's a secret that would rewrite what we think we know about Earth. Why was Operation High Jump equipped like an invasion force? What disappeared team never showed up on official books? And what did Admiral Byrd himself admit to seeing beneath the ice? We'll uncover what Robert Johnson took nearly 8 decades to say and why governments wanted it buried. The making of a legend, Admiral Richard Evelyn Byrd Jr. was not just another name in the annals of exploration. He was a man whose very life seemed pulled from the pages of an epic adventure novel. Born in 1888 to a well-known Virginia family, Byrd was born for greatness. From the time he entered the U.S. Navy, his life was one of bravery and forceful compulsion to be first at all times. His comrades admired him, his superiors trusted him, and the public loved him. With piercing blue eyes and a charisma that made headlines, Byrd was an officer, but more than an officer, he was a living emblem of American ambition. Byrd's legend was fixed early with a string of daring aerial exploits. In 1926, he professed to be the first to fly over the North Pole, an achievement that made him a household name and earned him the Congressional Medal of Honor. He followed that with historic flights across the Atlantic and to the South Pole, the first to conquer the globe's most unforgiving frontiers from the air. New York City rewarded him with not one, but 3 ticker-tape parades in his honor, an honor few could fantasize about, let alone attain. That hunger for exploration was more than glory quests. Each of those journeys would be, for Byrd, a test of human limits and a chance to go further than any man had gone before. Others saw the icy poles as barren wastelands, abandoned to the elements. Byrd saw them as empty pages waiting for the brush and ink of history to record their contours. This need to explore the unexplored would return him to Antarctica again and again, to increasingly daring and clandestine expeditions. Byrd's initial expedition to Antarctica in 1928 was one of monumental success. The party established the small American base on the Ross Ice Shelf, had made extensive aerial surveys, and with a touch of pizzazz skirted the enormous, untapped potential of the continent. His next significant expedition to Antarctica was in 1933, and it literally took a step bolder when he opted to be alone in a secluded meteorological station for 5 months, isolated from the worst environment on planet Earth, temperatures well below zero, and nearly lost his life from carbon monoxide poisoning. This near-death experience has not made him slow down. Instead, it made him more determined. But beneath all that dashing explorer-type bluster, one person knew that certain discoveries were too big or too hazardous to be shared with humanity. Rumors had started showing up in naval circles later in the 30s that Byrd's Antarctic expeditions were not for the simple reason of charting ice and monitoring weather. There appeared to be bizarre structures of navigation, anomalies, and geological marvels that just couldn't possibly have a rational explanation. None of these ended up on official press releases, but they were interesting enough to attract the U.S. government. It was in 1939, on the eve of another Antarctic expedition, that Lieutenant Byrd encountered 19-year-old Robert Johnson. Johnson, a San Diego Sea Scout, believed that he was volunteering for what would be a routine scientific mission. The interview was taking place in a Norfolk, Virginia naval facility. Johnson had anticipated being questioned about his sailing experience or technical expertise. Byrd looked him over and began to ask bizarre questions. Could he maintain a secret? Was he totally loyal to the United States? In that dimly lit chamber, Johnson felt something more was happening than simply the customary jaunt to Antarctica. Byrd did not require raucous adventurers. He required quiet, dependable men who would obey without question and never speak of what they witnessed. Johnson's steadiness and self-composure made him stand out from other volunteers, who were mostly talking about their former exploits. Without fanfare, Byrd singled them out from the others. What Johnson did not realize was that he had stepped onto the trail which would bind him to one of history's most enigmatic expeditions. He would see things that he would be unable to reveal for almost 80 years. He was merely a young man privileged to work alongside a living legend at the time, but soon would come to realize glory and discovery were only half of the story in Antarctica. Johnson had no idea yet, but his commitment would make him a witness to things any history book would never put in print. The icy chessboard to everyone but the most peripheral of individuals in the 1940s, Antarctica was a blank area at the bottom of the map, a vast expanse of white, inhabited only by penguins, seals, and screaming winds. To world powers on the cusp of the Cold War, however, it was something different. An enormous chessboard where the prize wasn't territory, but supremacy of the world. Under that ice, scientists believed, were massive mineral reserves, coal, oil, even uranium, that could fuel nations for generations. Whoever owned Antarctica wouldn't merely have bragging rights. They might possess the keys to the future. By the time Robert Johnson stepped onto it with Admiral Byrd, Antarctica was a quiet trophy in an unannounced race. It was bigger than the United States and Mexico together, with no government, borders, or legal claims acknowledged by the world. The great powers were aware that overnight this could be altered. A permanent base, a flag in the snow, an occupation for a few months would shift the balance of power. The image of Antarctic discovery was public, nearly idealized, courageous men facing sub-zero temperatures for the purposes of science. Papers published photographs of smiling sailors standing next to penguins or aviators standing in front of their ski planes. But behind the propaganda lay an entirely different truth. Countries weren't merely taking wind readings. Countries were charting potential airstrips, surveying supply lines, and unofficially staking out areas of richness. Johnson would recall later that even in the early days, the landscape of Antarctica was recalcitrant to a fault. Compasses rotated slowly in circles without ever pointing north. Radio transmissions would occasionally disappear in a static before returning as if nothing ever went wrong. The ice itself was uncanny. In spots, it wasn't quite pure white, being very lightly streaked and shines like a pearl illuminated, and sometimes it seemed to glow from within. Such would be quite vulnerable to scientific explanation, magnetic interference, atmospheric conditions. But the other ones, as Johnson insisted, were inexplicable. One flight was marked by the aurora australis, southern lights, transporting its patterns near seemingly intentionally as it twisted forms that would endure considerably longer than any light could in natural parameters. Old men who spent too many years out in the field would sometimes grumble that the lights were watching them. That was the sort of conversation that officers frowned upon but never quite could put down. Byrd himself would scarcely say a word about such idiosyncrasies, at least outside, but Johnson observed how intently the Admiral listened whenever such anomalies were mentioned. Once or twice, Byrd silently changed a flight plan or ordered a ground crew to scan the terrain for off readings. These side trips were never accounted for, and the official records would occasionally conflict with what the men remembered doing. The landscape contributed to their unease. Rising like jagged teeth from the flat ice, Antarctica's mountains saw their origins from bare rock, nearly black, that hung over the white horizon, ready to slice into the sky. Some slopes were completely free of snow, with dark stone exposed even at temperatures well below zero. There were murmurings, according to Johnson, that the exposed areas were, in fact, not entirely natural and had been formed by something from beneath the ice pushing upward. One day, Johnson was on a supply trip. Somewhere he saw something that would stay with him for decades. A huge crack in the ice, too deep to even see the bottom. Warming air, rushing out, curled in pale vapor into bitter cold. He stood at the rim, sensing the slightest vibration, almost as of distant machinery. Nothing in his training had anticipated it. But little did he realize that these crazy readings and odd geological idiosyncrasies and inexplicable phenomena were all silently documented, coded, and cabled back to Washington. To the men who were present, it was unsettling. To the strategist sitting comfortably out of harm's way, it was a puzzle and perhaps a chance. No longer was Antarctica a barren ice world. Instead, it was a battleground in the dark game of international power, where science marches hand in hand with secrecy. And for this game, Admiral Byrd and his crew were American players on the international chessboard. Unusual lights and shattered compasses were just the start. Before long, the U.S. Navy would be back in full force.